Thomas pressed his hand against the base of his cabin wall that would collapse inward like wet bread. He pulled back and stared at the black stain on his glove, then looked up at the rest of the structure. Fresh cedar siding, clean joints, a roof that had gone up 3 winters ago. From 10 feet away, the cabin looked perfect. From where he was crouching, it looked like a fraud. That is what they are selling you out here. And most people do not find out until it is already too late. Thomas had bought 22 acres outside of Fairbanks with a cabin the listing called recently constructed. He had assumed recently constructed meant built to last. That assumption cost him. And it is costing property owners all across interior Alaska right now. People who bought into the dream of remote land, a solid structure, a place that would hold against the winters. What they got instead was what that was already dying when the contractor cashed the check. Here is what nobody tells you when you buy rural property. In Alaska, the construction industry up here has quietly shifted toward a model that prioritizes one thing above everything else. Speed, not durability, not longevity, not the specific, demanding reality of subarctic conditions. Speed. And when you optimize for speed in a place like interior Alaska, you are not just cutting corners. You are building a countdown clock into the foundation of your home. Thomas grew up watching his grandfather build. The old man put up 3 structures on family land outside of Delta Junction. Every single one of them is still standing. His grandfather never went to school for construction. What he had instead was something more valuable. Decades of watching how Alaska treated the things men built. He knew the ground moved. He knew moisture was relentless. He knew that what left in contact with soil was what already in the process of dying. So he elevated everything. He sourced old-growth lumber where he could find it, tight-grained, dense, the kind of timber that had spent 100 years building up its defenses before it ever saw a blade. He sealed every gap. He vented every cavity. He built for the season after the season he was in. That knowledge did not get passed down. And the structures going up now are showing exactly what happens when it disappears. The rot in Thomas's cabin started at the sill plate. If you do not know what a sill plate is, pay attention, because this single piece of lumber is one of the most critical components in any wood frame structure, and it is the first place that modern Alaska cabin construction tends to fail. The sill plate is the lowest horizontal timber in the wall assembly. It sits directly on the foundation, in this case, concrete piers, and it carries the weight of every wall, every rafter, every load above it. It is in direct contact with the coldest, wettest part of the structure, and it needs to be protected. What Thomas found was that his sill plate had been installed with nothing between the wood and the concrete. No sill gasket, no moisture barrier, no capillary break of any kind. The concrete wicked moisture up into the lumber constantly, through rain, through snow melt sitting against the base, through the simple physics of a porous material in contact with another porous material in a climate that cycles through freeze and thaw dozens of times a year. The wood absorbed that moisture. The wood held it. And then fungal decay did exactly what fungal decay does when you give it warm, wet, oxygen-rich wood to work on. In less than 4 years, the corner of a brand new cabin was structurally compromised. Thomas tracked down the contractor through public records. This man had built 11 structures in the area over 6 years. Thomas drove out to look at 3 of them. 2 showed visible deterioration at the base. The third had already been partially rebuilt by its owner, a man named Dale, a retired pipeline worker who had caught the problem early and spent 2 full summers fixing it himself, out of his own pocket, because the contract was long gone and the warranty meant nothing. Dale was not furious about it. He was resigned. He showed Thomas the lumber he had pulled out, standard dimensional pine, the kind stacked at any big box hardware store in the lower 48. He asked Thomas if he knew what the moisture content typically ran on that lumber when it left the mill. The answer is around 19%, sometimes higher. The industry standard for structural lumber allows up to 19%, and that number is already marginal for construction in temperate climates. For interior Alaska, where dimensional stability is critical, where it needs to be as inert and dense as possible before the first winter hits it, 19% moisture content in fresh-cut softwood pine is not a standard. It is a liability. The lumber being used in these cabins had not been properly dried. It had been cut, milled, shipped north, and installed the same week it arrived. Fast, because the market rewarded fast and nothing else. What Thomas found was that his sill plate had been installed with nothing between the wood and the concrete. No sill gasket, no moisture barrier, no capillary break of any kind. The concrete wicked moisture up into the lumber constantly, through rain, through snow melt sitting against the base, through the simple physics of a porous material in contact with another porous material in a climate that cycles through freeze and thaw dozens of times a year. The wood absorbed that moisture. The wood held it. And then fungal decay did exactly what fungal decay does when you give it warm, wet, oxygen-rich wood to work on. In less than 4 years, the corner of a brand-new cabin was structurally compromised. Thomas tracked down the contractor through public records. This man had built 11 structures in the area over 6 years. Thomas drove out to look at 3 of them. 2 showed visible deterioration at the base. The third had already been partially rebuilt by its owner, a man named Dale, a retired pipeline worker who had caught the problem early and spent 2 full summers fixing himself out of his own pocket because the contractor was long gone and the warranty meant nothing. Dale was not furious about it. He was resigned. He showed Thomas the lumber he had pulled out, standard dimensional pine, the kind stacked at any big box hardware store in the lower 48. He asked Thomas if he knew what the moisture content typically ran on that lumber when it left the mill. The answer is around 19%, sometimes higher. The industry standard for structural lumber allows up to 19%, and that number is already marginal for construction in temperate climates. For interior Alaska, where dimensional stability is critical, where it needs to be as inert and dense as possible before the first winter hits it, 19% moisture content in fresh-cut softwood pine is not a standard. It is a liability. The lumber being used in these cabins had not been properly dried. It had been cut, milled, shipped north, and installed the same week it arrived. Fast, because the market rewarded fast, and nothing else. You need to understand the physics of this to understand why it matters so much in Alaska specifically. When wood dries improperly, when it is installed wet and then subjected to cycles of freezing and thawing, it moves. It swells when moisture content rises, and it contracts when moisture content drops. In a well-built structure, this movement is managed by proper detailing, proper fastening, proper ventilation. In a structure built for speed, those details are absent. The wood moves and the gaps open. Water finds the gaps. The water freezes in the gaps and expands, making the gaps larger. More water enters, more freezing, more expansion. And underneath all of it, the fungal colonies that cause rot are finding exactly the warm, dark, moist environment they need to work. Thomas found a builder named Ray who was constructing a cabin the old way on property about 40 miles out. Ray was taking twice as long as the standard timeline and spending around 30% more. He was sourcing local spruce that had been felled and left to dry for 2 full seasons before milling. He was not romantic about it. He did not talk about honoring tradition or preserving craft. He talked about physics. Properly dried wood is dimensionally stable, he said. It does not create the gaps that let water in. It does not give rot a foothold. He was building a structure designed to stand for 60 years. The cabin Thomas had bought, looking at the photographs Thomas showed him, would need major structural intervention within a decade, maybe sooner. So why is this happening? That is a question Thomas kept coming back to. Alaska is not a subtle environment. It is not a place that hides its demands. Every person who has spent real time here knows that winter does not forgive shortcuts. The old-timers knew it. The builders who came before knew it. Why are modern contractors ignoring knowledge that was once considered baseline and obvious? 3 things happen at the same time, and together they change what Alaska cabin construction actually looks like on the ground. The first is economic. The market for remote Alaska property changed. There's demand coming in now from buyers who have never lived through an interior winter. People buying land as an investment, as a fantasy, as a backup plan. They are not going to be the ones who find the rot. By the time the structure fails, they will have sold it to someone else, or they will be calling a contractor for repairs and absorbing the cost as a surprise they did not plan for. A contractor building for that market has a completely different incentive structure than a contractor building for a neighbor 3 miles down the road who will be watching that cabin for the next 30 years. When the buyer and the long-term inhabitant are the same person, quality gets priced in. When they are not, it does not. The second is regulatory. Alaska's building code situation is, to put it plainly, a problem. Codes vary dramatically by borough. Enforcement across rural areas is minimal. Not because inspectors do not care, but because the infrastructure for meaningful oversight simply does not exist at the scale these areas require. One inspector covering hundreds of square miles cannot physically verify every sill plate installation, every moisture barrier, every piece of flashing at every base of every structure going up. The code itself, in many jurisdictions, has not been meaningfully updated to reflect the specific performance demands of subarctic construction. It was adapted from lower 48 standards with modifications that experienced builders here will tell you are insufficient for conditions. The third is a loss of embedded knowledge. And this one is the hardest to fix. Thomas found a builder named Hector, late 70s, who had been constructing in the Fairbanks area since the early 1970s. Hector learned from men who had been building in Alaska since the 1940s. The things he described as standard practice: elevated foundations without exception, local timber dried before installation, ventilation designed for worst-case conditions rather than average conditions, every penetration in the building envelope treated as a potential water entry point and addressed accordingly. These were not innovations. They were the baseline. They were what you did if you intended the structure to survive. Hector watched the industry change over 30 years. He did not place all the blame on the contractors. He blamed the supply chain, which made it cheaper to truck in fast-grown softwood pine from mills in the Pacific Northwest than to source and process local timber. He blamed the financing structures, which rewarded fast completion dates. He blamed buyers who wanted a cabin done by fall and were not willing to pay for time. He said something Thomas wrote down word for word. Up here, time is a building material. You skip it, the building tells you eventually. That is what is happening right now all across the region. The buildings are telling people, and the people are paying. When Thomas started calculating what real repair would actually require, the number was significant. The sill plate on 2 walls needed to come out entirely. The concrete piers needed to be cleaned and sealed before any new wood went on them. New lumber, properly dried, locally sourced if possible, needed to go in with a proper sill gasket installed, properly flashed at the base, protected at every point where moisture could reach it. The floor framing in the affected corner needed partial replacement. The siding over the damaged area needed to come off and be reinstalled with correct water management detailing behind it. 2 separate contractors gave him estimates. Both were higher than the original inspection that had somehow missed all of this. What made Thomas most angry was not the money. It was the simplicity of what would have prevented it. A sill gasket costs a few dollars per linear foot. A moisture barrier between wood and concrete is one of the cheapest line items in any foundation detail. The principle of keeping structural wood isolated from ground moisture is not advanced knowledge. It is not specialized subarctic wisdom. It is fundamental building science that has been understood and documented for decades. Its absence in these structures was not the result of ignorance. It was a result of a system that never penalized cutting it out. Thomas talked to a young contractor named Connor, 26 years old, working independently now after a few years with the crew that had built Thomas's cabin. Connor was honest about what he had seen. He said he had asked questions at the time, had flagged some of the details that did not look right to him, and had been told it was fine. This was how they did it. They needed to keep moving. He had not pushed hard enough. He said that clearly. He was building differently now, slower, more carefully, with his attention on what would matter in a decade rather than what would matter at closing. Connor was the exception. The pressure that shaped him when he was working for someone else is still shaping most of the people doing this work in the region. They are not building badly because they want to. They are building badly because the system around them, the supply chain, the financing, the regulatory environment, the buyer market, does not consistently reward doing it right. Speed gets paid. Durability does not get priced until it fails, and by then the original contractor is usually nowhere to be found. Thomas started repairing the cabin himself, in stages, learning as he went. He was not a carpenter. He was methodical. He pulled out the bad wood and understood what had failed and why. and he replaced it with material installed the way it should have been from the beginning. It took 2 seasons. When he was done, the corner that had collapsed under his hand was solid. He also started talking to other property owners in the area, people who had bought in the last 5 or 6 years, who were living in structures built during the same period by the same small network of contractors working the same market. He did not alarm them. He told them where to look and what to look for. He described what early sill plate failure looks like, the discoloration, the softness, the way the base of the wall stops sounding solid when you knock on it. He described the water staining along interior base plates that appears in spraying, and that people convince themselves is just condensation. He told them when to call a professional and when they could assess it themselves. Most of them were grateful. A few had already noticed things they had not known how to name. There is something about the cold up here that cuts through ambiguity. A building works or it does not. A joint holds water out or it lets it in. A piece of wood is sound or it is rotting. There is no middle ground that lasts. Alaska has always worked this way. It closes a gap between what you thought you built and what you actually built, and it closes it faster than anywhere else. That gap is getting wider. More structures are going up. More buyers are arriving who do not know what to look for. And the reckoning for all of them is coming at the same pace it always has. Thomas stood outside his cabin one evening in late October, the first snow of the season coming down through the birch trees. The cabin looked the same from a distance as it always had. Same siding, same roof line, same structure. But he knew what was underneath now. He knew what was holding it up and why. He knew which parts of it he could trust. That knowledge cost him more than he expected. But in this place, knowledge is what keeps things standing. The builders who forgot that left their work scattered across the landscape, solid looking from 10 feet away, softening at the base, waiting for the next person to press a hand against the wood and feel it give. Thomas had been that person. He was not going to be that person again. And now, neither are you.